Was not, okay, there it goes. All right. Suicide was not on my script this morning, but it's in our hearts. It's been the topic of conversation. So I just feel moved to address it up front. In my work in the VA Medical Center, I sit on the suicide prevention team. And every week we go through a list of veterans who are high risk for suicide. We discuss them, we talk about interventions. In some cases, I get directly involved, or we refer to other providers. So when we hear stories and news of suicide, it is tragic. It breaks our hearts. And in the world I occupy, in the VA community, we still see 20 to 22 veteran suicides in the United States a day. So it's something I've been involved with. And the VA Medical Center has invested great resources into suicide prevention. So as we sit with the grief and the loss of Jefferson and reflect on the tragedy of young people committing suicide, it seems appropriate we also just educate ourselves about suicide prevention, intervention, things that we can do proactively to keep people from taking their own lives in this way. So there are trainings available, and maybe in the future I can offer one to the congregation. But simple things, by recognizing signs and symptoms, and then being able to ask a difficult question, which maybe we're not used to asking, maybe we've never asked. But to be able to look at somebody when we recognize signs and symptoms and ask them directly, are you thinking of killing yourself right now? And then wait and listen for an answer. So those kinds of skills any of us can have, to be able to recognize signs and symptoms, to be able to ask questions, and then to be able to know how to intervene appropriately and make referrals in a moment of crisis. It's something all of us ought to know. So the topic of suicide, it does relate, I think, in ways to the message I had planned to share this morning about spiritual health. Suicide comes out of a place of despair and of hopelessness, a place of spiritual unhealth. What I brought to share with you this morning is some research and some of the science around measuring spiritual health. We've all been particularly attentive to our health over the past year. I've had my temperature taken more than 250 times over the last year. I've stuck in more swabs up my nose in the last 6 months than I hope I'll ever do for the rest of my life, taking my twice weekly COVID tests, even after the vaccine. And we've all been taking our temperatures, paying close attention for signs and symptoms that we may have become infected. What we may not be paying so much attention to is this idea of spiritual health. So I want to explore that with you today. I want to share some of the research that's out there and offer a couple of definitions and show you 2 scales that might be useful as we conduct our own self-inventory as to our own spiritual health. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you some of the research. let me start with this paper here. And I want to show you the right one. This is about measuring spirituality. So before we get into the topic of spiritual health, I just want to give you a sense of some of the research that's been done, clinical research about spirituality and its relationship to healthcare. So this is a paper that was published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. And it's an interesting paper because they look at all of the instruments that have been developed to measure spirituality. And I want to just show you their table here because it gives a good synopsis of some of the work that's been done in the scientific field to measure spirituality. So let me see if I can position this in a way so that you can see it. So I know it's going to be small, but what I'm showing you here is a table of current measures for spirituality. So on the left, you can see the list of measures, and I'm just going to read a few of these because you won't be able to see them. There's the daily spiritual experience scale, the spiritual assessment scale, the spiritual health inventory, the spirituality scale, the expressions of spirituality inventory, the spiritual transcendence index, the spiritual well-being scale. Okay, so you get the idea. There are a lot of measures that have been developed to take a look at our spirituality. On the right side, if you can see it, are a list of domains that are being investigated as people work towards measuring spirituality. So I'll just give you a few of those domains because it gives you a sense of the area we're exploring. Some of those domains include peacefulness, a loving God, a sense of harmony, connectedness, life satisfaction, punishment, self-esteem, meaning, connectedness. I think I said that already. So this idea of spirituality has been a topic of great inquiry in clinical research. Out of all of this research, there have been scales developed trying to measure spiritual health. So if we're going to investigate spiritual health, people may start at some place like Amazon or Google. So I did. So here's what you might find if you go to Amazon or Google trying to inquire about spiritual health. Let me see if I can pull that up for you. Okay, we'll start with Amazon. So this is a very well-rated book that you can find on Amazon, 10 Questions to Diagnose Your Spiritual Health. Well, I thought this is a very interesting title, and I was thinking about purchasing it, but then I took a view at the table of contents to get a glimpse of the questions. So let me show you what the questions are in this very well-reviewed book. These are the questions that we are told by this author, in this case, Donald Whitney, to ask when assessing our spiritual health. Do you thirst for God? Let's see. Do you delight in being the bride of Christ? Do you yearn for heaven and to be with Jesus? Okay, enough said about that. So there is one measure of spiritual health out there that I think doesn't work well for our community. If we went with that measure of spiritual health, we would be very unwell people. I don't think we are unwell in that way. So let's take a look at other ideas of spiritual health. So I also went to Google and I did a search of images. What comes up when you type in spiritual health and are looking at images. I thought this was kind of interesting. Of course, you can do this too, but if you type in spiritual health in Google Images, you get a lot of pictures of people by themselves doing yoga at the ocean. Oh, that's very interesting. Lots of pictures of spiritually healthy people alone by the ocean doing yoga. So that's another idea about spiritual health. Let's go a little bit deeper. Fortunately, we've got more to work with. And I want to take you now to some, I think, really impressive research that's come out of India. India is a very spiritual culture, and they have done some research that I think is worth paying attention to. So let me share with you a paper that was published in 2011 about a spiritual health scale. And this was published in the Indian Journal of Community Medicine. And these authors came up with a spiritual health scale they called the fourth dimension of health. So they're really addressing the World Health Organization, and they mention this here in the body of the paper. The World Health Organization identifies three dimensions of health: physical, mental, and social. And so these authors are arguing for a fourth dimension of health, a spiritual health. And they even reference here a meeting and a working group that was charged to develop this fourth dimension of health for the World Health Organization. But let me just share some of the highlights of this paper. I highlighted them actually. It's an impressive body of research. They looked at three domains, developed 6 constructs, and found 27 determinants of spiritual health using a scientific process. A statistically reliable and valid spiritual health scale, they developed that, containing 114 items, was developed. They did validity and retest reliability for an urban adult educated population. And they claim that this scale is the first of its kind in the world to measure the spiritual health of a common worldly person, which is devoid of religious and cultural bias. Its items have universal applicability. So that's a pretty impressive claim, and it seems to go well with us who, like both religious and cultural bias, and we like to be devoid of that, and we strive for universal principles. So I think this scale is worth a closer look. The authors of this paper come up with their own definition of spiritual health, and here it is. This is their suggested definition: a state of being where an individual is able to deal with day-to-day life in a manner which leads to the realization of one's full potential, meaning and purpose of life, and happiness from within. Then they come up with an operational definition for their development of their measure. Spiritual health is a state of health reflected through 3 domains: self-evolution, self-actualization, and transcendence. Those are the 3 domains. And then they offer these definitions here, which I've highlighted in the body of the paper. Self-evolution, they define as a state of becoming, where the individual is analyzing and applying the self in terms of thoughts and actions with respect to the wider perspective and nurturance. Self-actualization is reaching a state of being, where the individual is consciously aware and responds to the situation, events, people, and environment with engineering from within and deeper meaning, purpose of life. And then the third domain is transcendence, is a state of inner happiness and behaving accordingly through universal love, sublimating jealousy, and considering oneself as part of the supreme or beyond self. So I really like this. I really like the language. I think it's very inclusive. It's very universal in scope. And it's impressive, the amount of work they did. I just want to show you the determinants of spiritual health. They came up with 27, and they used a scientific process to come up with these 27 determinants. But I think it's just a great list of indicators of spiritual health. They include things like commitment, introspection, honesty, creativity, contemplation, prayer, philanthropy, extending self, empathy, questioning injustice, aesthetics, value for time, being away from comparison, human values, courage, managing ego, humor, sixth sense, virtue, sensitivity, purpose for one's life, compassion, pure feelings, faith in the supreme, selfless action. That was just a quick run through. I know that's quite a list to grasp. So the measure itself was published and it was tested with different populations. And I'll show you what it looks like. A spiritual health assessment scale. It's got these 3 domains: self-development, actualization, realization. And it's a Likert scale, 1 to 5. I don't know. Wait a minute. Did I share that with you? Hold on. Let me show you that one. Hold on. Okay. Can you see that now? This is the scale itself as it was published. It's a little bit more simple than all of those words I just listed. You scale yourself on a scale of 1 to 5. Never is 1, always is 5. And then you take a look at how you're doing in terms of self-development, self-actualization, and self-realization. Finally, there's one more scale. I said I would share 2 scales. This one is the one that I was most impressed with, that is based on research that I think is universal in terms of its language and inclusive. However, it's still a lot to work with. I found something a little bit more simple that I'd like to share with you as we bring this to a close, and then invite that more simple scale to be the basis for some reflection and discussion as a community. This scale only has 4 items. Actually, I find this scale that I'm sharing with you now very useful in my work with the, wait a minute. Why did that happen? Let's see. I find this scale very helpful in my work with veterans. Okay, so this is called a spiritual health assessment. It's based on the work of healing the 4 dimensions of spiritual pain in the classical sacred art of living and dying tradition. And it's published, it's available online, and it's simple. So the question then is, how are you within yourself today? How are you within yourself today? I invite you to ask yourself that question as we go through these 4 domains of this survey. The first domain is meaning, the second is forgiveness, the third is relatedness, and the 4th is hope. How are you within yourself today with regards to meaning? Is your life filled with purpose and meaning? That would be on the 1 scale, the 1 end. Or has your life become meaningless? That would be on the 5 end. How are you within yourself today with regards to forgiveness? Do you feel a deep sense of reconciliation towards yourself and others? Well, then you would be a 1. Or are you feeling a strong sense of unforgiveness towards yourself and others? Well, that would be a 5. How are you within yourself today with regards to relatedness? Do you feel a strong sense of connection with the persons and things that matter most to you? Well, you would be a 1. Or are you feeling seriously alienated from someone or something that is important to you? You would be a 5. How are you within yourself today with regards to hope? Do you feel hope-filled and optimistic? You would be a 1. Or are you feeling and experiencing deep depression and hopelessness? And you would be a 5. I like this scale very much. It's simple, it's practical, and I've used it with the veterans in my care. In fact, I'm often dealing with veterans who are at the 4 or the 5 range for all of those areas. And those are the veterans who end up often on our high risk list for suicide. So people who are spiritually unhealthy by the measure that I just showed you, I think are people who are at high risk of suicide, people without meaning, people without a sense of hope, people who are not connected, they're isolated, people who don't have a sense of purpose. It's a useful measure for ourselves and also for the ones that we love and care for. Just to check in with people, how are you within yourself today with regards to these 4 areas? So I leave you with that question and invite some community reflection. I invite you to think about these measures. Are they useful? Do you agree that spiritual health can be measured by looking at these 4 domains of meaning, forgiveness, relatedness, hope? Maybe you don't agree. Maybe you think there are other determinants. What's missing? What should be added? How do you define spiritual health? I'll turn it over to Jay to lead a discussion.
So we have some time to just offer our reflections about this topic, these questions. I know for myself, often it is that capacity to be more self-accepting. You know, they know that that's also a very important component to wholesomeness. So it's open here for discussion or reflection. Hollis. You're muted, Hollis.
Well, when I was studying psychology as a part of getting my degree in occupational therapy, we had to study a lot of psychology, different issues. And one of the things, the self-actualization, that comes from Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. And I always like that. If you're not familiar with it, the first need is just shelter, food, water. And then you gradually go up to the scale where you're fully self-actualized. And that made a lot of sense to me. But I really like these scales, Chris, that you showed us. And I would love to download them and take them myself and see where I am. It's not always productive to mark something like spirituality on a scale and change it to numbers, but it does help organize our brains and gives us a sense of just where we are. So I appreciate this talk very much.
Thank you, Hollis. Anyone else? Reflection, thoughts? Marcia.
Excellent talk, Reverend Chris. I would add one element, I think, and that is sense of humor. It seems to me that that is one of the things that you brought to this talk, especially early on when we were having examples of spirituality that caused me to laugh a little. And that to me seems like one of the healthiest indications of spiritual well-being.
Thanks, Michael. It was actually one of the 27 determinants of spiritual health identified by the Indian authors.
Rose.
Hi. Yeah, I was surprised on the second assessment, the having one question, do you forgive yourself and others? And, like, okay, I forgive myself, but the people who tried to overthrow our government by violence on the 6th of January, I don't forgive them. So I guess that would move my point total the wrong way. And I don't know that I should forgive them, but I think it's unhealthy to immediately forgive people for unforgivable acts. And I remember you talked about the one dying Nazi that asked forgiveness and he didn't get it. And I don't think that's unhealthy, not forgiving atrocities.
I think that's a great point, and I'm not convinced that that spiritual health means 5 in all of those 4 categories. I'm not convinced of that myself. I think it's more complicated than that. But I'm curious about what other people think.
Marcia, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I love instruments. They give you really something helpful to go by, and you can always slice and dice it a little bit, but I really like them. I like MMPIs, Enneagrams, all of that stuff, and I really like some of this. But I think the thing that I find helpful but also difficult is that wherever you are, sometimes it's finding what direction do I need to move today? Is it relational? Is it inward? Is it intellectual? Is it nature? What would be helpful to me at any given time? So that if you're talking about taking all those various categories and what is it that what is it that would be good for me to do at any given point, trying to intuit or decide a direction. You know what I mean? That's it.
Beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's like sort of what you're speaking to is how we orient toward well-being, what supports our well-being. And it's always in motion, it's always dynamic. Rose.
Hi, everybody. This is Rose O'Neill. I am writing a couple of sermons for the future. One is called Does Prayer Work? And the other one is Friendship and Health. So as I was researching it, I learned that the scientists think prayer is good for you. And like there's been experiments done, and, lower blood pressure, things like that. And it doesn't matter who you're praying to. It's very general and all encompassing. And the interesting thing about friendship, I learned, is that it's also healthy for you, and your friends can help you heal. And they don't have to be in the same room. They just have to be your friend somewhere in the world. And I thought those things are very endearing.
Thank
I
you,
see
Rose.
Linda, I see Hollis, and yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly mention, Rose, one of the pamphlets that we have in our building is Unitarian Universalism and Prayer. So I don't know if you've seen that, but I haven't read it, remember, but that would be a good source.
Linda?
Linda Mangelsdorf speaking, and I just wanted to go back to what Patrick said about forgiveness. And for me, there are places in my life where I haven't been able to come to forgiveness yet. But my belief is that forgiveness only harms, or the lack of forgiveness only hurts me, because it's causing me to hold on to the unpleasant or unhappy or angry or whatever-ness. And without some kind of understanding or awareness or something of the unforgivable seemingly act, it's very, very difficult to forgive. In the long run, though, it only hurts me if I don't. And the other thing about the coming to these services, for me, I can spend a lot of time in my head. Coming here brings me back into my heart, which is a very necessary place to be. So thank you all for helping me with that.
I think we have time for a couple more. There's Lydia and Sue-Ann.
Hi there, I'm Lydia, and I'm actually the most uncomfortable when that's around standards and measurements and charts and all that sort of thing. I did enjoy self-actualized awareness in college, just like Hollis was saying. But for me, to spend a whole time looking at screens about these measurements of these different qualities, it doesn't touch me at all. But now I'm just me. A lot of people think mathematically. A lot of people like organizing things in a mathematical or chart-like frame. And that helps them maybe gauge where they are. I would certainly be useless to me in any time in my life, because I have a gut feeling, a connection, and I know in my heart. And if I don't know at all where I stand on something or where I'm growing or failing, I do reach out to a higher power. Sometimes it's a prayer, sometimes it's a walk in the woods, sometimes it's a deep conversation with other people who are in tune to their intellect heart connection, their spiritual connection. But charts are meaningless to me just because they don't touch my heart, or they don't touch my growth, or they don't. Well, that's just me. Anyway, but I didn't mean to put you down personally, Chris. But this kind of thing is why I love a spiritual and emotional kind of connection to faith, and love it when somebody sings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lydia. And I think we have time
Yeah.
for one more. Yes,
Hi,
Sue-Ann.
this is Nora. There are two things that come to mind is in terms of forgiving and not forgiving, and then on balance. I think that one cannot forgive certain things that have happened or that they see, because I think it builds knowledge of some sort of standard of what is acceptable, although it's difficult to bear sometimes. But it builds integrity. But I also think that balance is important, and Marcia was talking about to pursue your intellect, or to pursue your art or whatever. I think that in all of this is important to maintain a balance, and I think maintaining a balance is easier to go on the path of opening up, so you find your spirituality and touch your spirituality. And I appreciate the time that these services, so I can kind of explore that spiritual nature. I run around so much that I wish I would meditate more also, to touch on this part of myself as a human being.
Sue-Ann and Jim, I think we have time for Sue-Ann and then Jim.
Great.
Hello, this is Sue-Ann. I just wanted to second what Linda said earlier, probably because I've been reading John Lewis's memoir, which is over 20 years old, but his history of the civil rights movement in the early 60s, and his training in nonviolence, in which he's talking about you see those people who are ugly and hateful as infants, and you see them as loving people, and that things have happened to them to create the hateful and ugly person they behave as, but they are a loving person, and you must see them as a loving person and forgive them. It's not easy.
Jim, yeah, I think you get the last word.
Just a couple quick things. Mike was talking about comedy. There are some famous comedians who committed suicide, which would suggest that jokes and humor and comedy can be an effort to cover despair. Patrick was talking about forgiveness. The Bible talks about righteous indignation and kind of holds that up. And whenever I see a scale to measure things, I think of competition, and I wonder if at some point there might be, God forbid this, spiritual Olympics where people compete to see who's the most spiritual.
So thank you all. We are going to have a closing piece of music.